Good evening and welcome to a special episode of Talk the Walk. With us tonight is Hong Kong's outgoing leader, Chief Executive Carrie Lam. Mrs. Lam, thank you for coming back onto the show. I believe this is the third time already.
Okay.
So I know you've accepted a lot of interviews in the past week or two, but I still have to get it out of my chest. So there are only days before your retirement. So are you really ready to step down? Because I think you've only turned 65 recently, and that's a relatively young age in this day.
No, had I stayed as a civil servant, I would have retired at the age of 60. So in that respect, I have already overdone my period as a public servant. I have no regret having completed the 5-year term as a chief executive. So I am looking forward to my well-earned retirement.
So when you joined the government back in the 1980s, has it ever occurred to you that, has it ever crossed your mind that you might be taking the top job one day?
Of course not. In those days, there were no position of chief executive. I joined in 1980. Hong Kong was then under British administration with a governor sent from the United Kingdom. So people should really be very gratified that after reunification in 1997, we have Hong Kong people administering Hong Kong. We have our own chief executive who has to be a Chinese national, a Hong Kong permanent resident, somebody who has lived in Hong Kong for a very long time. But never in my career had I ever sort of told myself that I should try to get onto a higher position. My primary mission as a public servant is really to serve the people of Hong Kong and to help build a better Hong Kong.
Okay, so speaking of retirement, I know it is almost customary for former chief executives to be appointed a position in Beijing, so as CCPC Vice Chairman, so for Mr. Donald Tsang. So I know you've said during a recent interview that it's not something that's on your mind right now, that you wouldn't fight for having such a position. But what you said following that comment actually drew my attention. You said it was the same when you became chief secretary or even chief executive. It wasn't something that you fought for.
Yes.
Would you care to explain what you meant by that?
I thought it was all in the public domain. I joined the political team as Secretary for Development, serving the third-term government. By the end of my tenure as a Secretary for Development, I actually have made plans to stay closer to my sons in the United Kingdom. So I have no aspiration to stay in the government or to even take on a higher position. But the then Chief Executive-elect has urged me and asked me to stay on. What has driven me to agree is because I have years of experience as a public servant, whereas the then chief executive was very much an outsider coming in, although he had served in the executive council. But it isn't the same. Executive council is a senior advisor to the chief executive. So in a way, I persuaded myself to stay for another 5 years to make sure that we could, or as a whole, the government could continue to serve the people of Hong Kong and build Hong Kong.
So let me clarify on that point. By then Chief Executive-elect, I think you meant Mr. C.Y. Leung back in 2012, that he urged you to join his cabinet, not cabinet, as Chief Secretary. Is that right?
He was an EXCO convener for a few years. So I was a principal official, so he did invite me from time to time to talk about his plans, his vision, especially on the livelihood issues like housing and poverty. And so I have a little bit of understanding of what he wanted to do as a chief executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And so I persuaded myself that with my years of experience in the public service, I could perhaps provide him with the necessary support.
So would it be fair, would it be correct to say that if it wasn't Mr. C.Y. Leung's invitation, that you wouldn't have stayed on until today?
Probably.
Okay, yeah. Then, but then I think in another recent interview, you said you have also no plans to set up a think tank or something like a policy group advocating different kind of policies for the upcoming administration, because that would almost amount to interference. But that's what Mr. C.Y. Leung and Mr. Tung Chee-hwa has been doing for a lot of years. Do you think the think tanks have actually contributed to your policy making?
Well, first is I'm only commenting my own arrangement. And I said that I do not have that network and resources. Setting up think tanks require a lot of resources, both financial and manpower, and of course time. Since I am taking retirement, I would rather spend more time for myself and my family. So it is with that premises that I do not wish to set up any think tank and policy group like that. And secondly, I'm not commenting or criticizing what my predecessors have done. One is to look at their respective background, the timing of their doing this sort of thing, and the nature of their group and foundation and so on. But my unique position is because I've been in the government for over 40 years. I've been a Secretary for Development, the Chief Secretary for Administration, and the Chief Executive. Almost every policy that the next government will have to implement, whether it is a housing policy, land policy, education policy, Northern Metropolis, land out tomorrow, these policies were formulated during my term with myself as the Chief Executive and my team. So you imagine, shortly after this Chief Executive and this team retreats from the scene, they continue to comment on how these policies should be carried out. Isn't it right? I don't think it is right. Yeah. But for other people to form think tanks to provide their extra inputs to policy formulation, that's always fine.
So if I may use the word meddling in the next administration, and you kept us guessing for a very long time whether you would seek a second term. Yeah. You announced in April that you've decided to take a step back and spend more time with your family. And then you also revealed that this decision not to seek a second term was actually reached in March last year, if I'm correct, and that you've informed the state leaders in Beijing during a visit in March last year. So during this whole time, it's been more than a year, and you've also had another policy address during that time period. Did you do everything with the mindset that you were stepping down, or would there be ever a moment that you think, okay, I might be able to change my mind still?
No. No.
So you have made a very firm decision and you stuck to it.
And that is my decision. I don't want people to have the impression that that was an agreed arrangement between myself and the central government. I expressed my very firm and clear aspiration and decision to the central government in March last year at Beijing. And thereafter, whatever I do, have this plan in mind.
And so, but then I want to talk about the government restructuring proposal in your final policy address. If you have already decided to step down, then why did you make such a proposal?
Well, I'm sorry, Raymond. Whoever asked that question perhaps do not fully appreciate this person, Carrie Lam. I do not stop doing just because it is none of my business. I try to lay the groundwork for other things to happen, provided that groundwork or that basis is essential for Hong Kong's future development and will serve Hong Kong people better. So having been in the government for so many years, having been the Chief Secretary for Administration, coordinating all these government bureaus and departments, and as a Chief Executive, I I thought I knew better than many people what sort of structure would serve the place better. And I know the process of getting through a major government reorganization. It requires the approval of the Executive Council. It involves the enactment of legislation, the application for extra funding, and then finally the approval of the Legislative Council. And all these processes would take time, even with a very supportive Executive Council and Legislative Council. It had to take time. And what people have seen about this reorganization is only on the surface. Behind the scene, all the bureaus and departments have a lot of work to do. They have to reshuffle. They have to decide how to sort of cut up the job between two bureaus. They even have to print all the business cards and also all these names of their officers and so on. So it would be almost impossible for the new chief executive or the CE-elect to start afresh without any groundwork being done.
Okay.
So since my mission is to serve the people, not serve myself, if something is good for Hong Kong, then of course I feel obliged to do it for Hong Kong.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Lam, I have to interrupt you for a moment. We'll go to a break and we'll come back to that point after that. Stay with us.